It was a normal day for the Wattersons. They were watching TV in the living room on the couch like usual when all of a sudden the news came on, and there was a broadcast about the weather and how it was gonna snow. Gumball and Darwin were excited because if there was snow, that meant there was no school. But the broadcasters said that this wasn't a good thing, and that a severe blizzard was coming to Elmore, and for the citizens to be prepared for it, and that it would be there within a couple of days. After that, the broadcast ended, and the Wattersons went back to their normal thing of watching TV. And by then, a couple of days had passed, and it began to snow, just like the reporter said. It was now Monday morning, and Gumball and Darwin woke up and looked out their window to see a massive snow pile over every inch of Elmore that they could see. And they jumped up and down in joy. And that's when they got the news that school was canceled for the day. And they couldn't be happier. So they went downstairs and just started to chill and watch TV. The other Wattersons came down and they started watching TV like they did on Saturday. And as they did that, the hours started to pass by. And with that, the snow started to build up. And by the time the Wattersons were having dinner, the snow was at least 3 to 4 feet high. And that's when another broadcast came on, and the reporter on this one said that the blizzard was only just beginning, and that it was getting worse, and that it would last for at least another week, if not a week and a half. The Wattersons heard this and couldn't believe just how bad this blizzard had gotten. When they looked out the window, they saw that it was already feet high, and they wondered how high it could possibly get. But they decided to do the only thing they could do in that situation, and just continue on like normal. And as the days passed by, the snow continued to pile up, until after a week after that broadcast, things started to get bad. The Wattersons woke up and looked out the window to see an unbelievably high amount of snow. It was at least 10 to 12 feet high, and they knew there was no possible way to get out of their house. And what was even worse was that it had knocked down the power lines, and they lost power, which means they lost access to their AC, and more importantly, the heat. And it was starting to get colder in the house, so the Wattersons just decided to cover up with blankets and anything else warm that they could find. And they just spent the day playing board games in their living room. But after they had just finished one of the board games, they heard something coming from the door, and it was as if the door was shaking. That's when, all of a sudden, the door came off its hinges, and a gigantic pile of snow came into the house. The Wattersons freaked out, and they didn't know what to do. Gumball, Darwin, and Richard all got shovels, and they started to try and dig the snow out of their house. But it was to no avail, and so they were stuck, with the cold entering their house, and no way of heating it back up, and with their front door off its hinges. They decided to just go to bed, and in the morning they would do something about it. So after they woke up, Richard and Nicole decided that they would go find somebody to help. And so they attempted by using a sled to get through the snow to go and find help. And they left Gumball, Darwin, and Anais by themselves. Hours went by, and still they hadn't returned. And hours turned into days, and I started to fear the worst. And the blizzard only continued to get worse. And so, the three of them decided to go and try and find their parents. And so, the three of them found another sled, and somehow managed to get on top of all of the snow, and started to sled their way through Elmore in order to find their parents. Hours passed by, and still nothing, and it was getting dark soon. Eventually, it became nighttime, and still no sign of Richard or Nicole. That's when Anais fell off of the sled and into the snow, and she started to sink. Gumball and Darwin started to panic and started to dig through the snow, but they couldn't find her, and Anais just continued to sink to the bottom until she finally reached it. And she started to panic as she couldn't escape and she couldn't breathe. After about 10 minutes, Anais had suffocated to death, and Gumball and Darwin were still trying to look for her, but they couldn't find her. They started to panic, but things still went downhill from there. And that's when the wind started to pick up and the temperature started to drop. That's when Darwin looked at his hands and realized he was getting frostbite. They had no choice but to return home. And that's when they started their journey back to their house, realizing that Anais was gone and that if they didn't want the same fate, they had to return home. They realized that their parents must have died as well. When they finally reached their house, Gumball was excited, and when he turned around to talk to Darwin, Darwin didn't move. In fact, Darwin was frozen. Gumball then came to the terrible realization that Darwin had froze to death. Gumball then realized that he was probably the only member of his family that was still alive. His parents had not returned after days. His sister had probably suffocated, and his brother had froze to death. And Gumball, now distraught, just entered back into his home. And then he came to another horrible realization. They were out of food. So Gumball just gave up and sat there with the raging wind and snow continuing to fall. And eventually, after about a week, the snow started to melt, but the damage was done. Nicole and Richard had not returned, and most likely were dead. Anais had suffocated to death in the snow. Darwin had froze to death, and Gumball had frozen and starved to death, suffering a fate similar to his family.